And I'm really delighted to introduce my colleague, Shelley Stahl, who's AGU's Director of Data Programs, and she's going to be the moderator for this webinar today. So take it away, Shelley.
Thank you, Pranoti. I'm delighted that we have two incredible speakers coming from a couple different points of view having to do with supporting data management needs of the faculty. And I thank you for your participation today. We selected the topic because of the prominence and groundswell that we're seeing for well-documented and well-preserved data supporting science and publications. And this is especially important for transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work where it's harder and harder to find the data that's necessary if you're not as familiar with the other domains, scientific domains that you're working with. And another reason is it's really important for our authors of the data and the authors of the publication to get credit for these well-preserved and well-documented data sets. And by focusing on the importance and providing the right services for those, for your researchers, this is really important goals going forward. So could you guys advance the slide, please? Thank you. So our first speaker is Greg Madden. He is the Senior Advisor for Research Computing and Cyber Infrastructure for Penn State University. Here, his role is to improve the overall function of the research computing and research data ecosystem in the university. He also serves as an advocate for the research faculty. His focus at Penn State is across the entire data lifecycle, including high performance computing, advanced research consulting, high speed and secure networking, data centers, and issues surrounding software and data acquisition and licensing. He has been in higher education for over 30 years. He's worked in several different colleges and universities in various positions. And he has a master's in geography from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as a bachelor's in computer science and philosophy from University of Alabama. Greg, please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Shelley. And I think we can probably skip that slide, and I'll just give a very brief introduction to myself. So I was hired into this role about 3 years ago by a group of faculty. They referred to themselves as a faculty insurgency, and their complaint was that the university did not do a good job of supporting research computing. I discovered very quickly that that was true, but that we also don't do a very good job of supporting research data, and that in fact it's essentially the intersection of researchers, research administrators, research computing services, and library services that aren't particularly designed to work well together. So next slide. And I will say as well, you know, two of the things I do, I'm the co-chair of our research data lifecycle working group for the university, as well as the co-chair of our open access working group, where we're developing an open access policy right now. So my motivation for the presentation essentially is my entire job is to give research time back to researchers and their research groups, making it easier to acquire research data as well as research cyber infrastructure, and to sort of meet their requirements for open research and for open data, but also to make it easier to acquire secure data. So I focus on the entire research data lifecycle, including both secure data as well as open data, and the whole thing. So next slide. And so I guess another motivation for this is that interdisciplinary work is what this is all about. At a university, certainly at Penn State, when you're looking at services that are offered, some by individual colleges, some by individual departments, some by the libraries, some by the VPR, some by the Central Research Administration, etc., what you have is a wildly interdisciplinary problem. And we don't have anything on the administrative side of the house, which is similar to a sort of strategic interdisciplinary research office that you might have on the academic side. So what we found at this university, at least, is that our various administrative services are expected to figure out on their own how to work with one another, even though they really don't share any tools and they really don't share any communications forums. and in many cases, they aren't particularly aware that one another exists. And as an example, just this week, I was talking about data management plans, and I had 3 different units raise their hand and say, well, we've already solved this problem. And they all 3 perceive themselves as having solved it at the university level, and yet none of the 3 of them even knew that the other ones were working on it. So that's kind of the sort of the state of the art, at least at our university. So next slide. So the importance of the interdisciplinarity is that things that seem simple from the outside, so from a faculty perspective, it might look easy. When you look at the university, we're just not set up to take care of these things. So if you say you must protect the data adequately, that can have impacts across many years, all the way from the time you're creating a proposal through to the post-publication. And yet the units that are involved over this, sometimes maybe 7 or 9 year period of a research project really aren't equipped with tools or information about one another to help you as researchers. So next slide. So this is just a very recent example. In the last 6 months, we were told to acquire data with security conditions. It doesn't matter what the security conditions were. And just to show, all of these different offices on the screen were involved in acquiring this data. So the researcher and their whole group, the research design specialists in the libraries and in the grants and contracts offices, your whole sponsored programs, purchasing risk, export, all of those kinds of people, auditors, our electronic research administrators, and then that's just on the sort of research administrative side. And on the IT side, it's everyone from the security office to the desktop IT, server IT, storage IT, network IT, on and on down the line. And so when you look at this from an institutional perspective, a simple clause, acquire data, and it has to meet these security conditions, can end up affecting 20 some odd offices. And so next slide. So this is the sort of current state. These various services lack sufficient information about one another. They don't successfully communicate upstream to ensure they're receiving the information they need. They don't successfully communicate downstream so the next group knows what to do. They lack tools with which to pass information among themselves. They have processes that don't match up well, so that when one group does something, it doesn't match up well to what the next group needs. And then the biggest problem really is that researchers may not know who to contact in what order to keep things moving along. That is probably the biggest problem we have, is researchers are left to sort of hunt and peck on the phone to try to find people who can help, and have to sort of magically know what order to use people in. And then finally, the sheer number of services means that even if all 20 of those services are doing a brilliant job, the fact that they have to hand off from one to another means that the inevitable delays add up very quickly. And even though you may have a whole bunch of excellent services all doing an excellent job, the perception on the side of the researcher is that it takes too long and the university isn't good at what it's doing. So it's unfortunate sort of for everybody. Next slide. And so I want to definitely make sure I'm focusing, because I realize we are talking primarily to faculty here, that there are some opportunities for you to help improve your university. And so what I'm going to do next is show you 5 things you can do to help improve your university. But you yourself as an individual faculty member may not be able to make this happen on your own. I certainly am not able to make it happen on my own. So you need to know who to talk to and what committees to get involved in to try to put things in motion to make things better. And I think that some of them are obvious. Your vice president for research has to be on board with improving the research data lifecycle services. Your vice president for IT needs to be on board, because a lot of these are IT related services. The dean of the libraries needs to be on board, because you have the whole research data management. Open access is probably under the libraries, or open data may be under the libraries. And then the chief information security officer needs to be on board, because when you're looking at these sort of secure data side of things, you've got to make sure you're securing things properly. And then you have a lot of committees that are scattered around your university that may be very helpful as well. I would probably not do it in this order. I would most likely start with your faculty senate IT committees, or faculty senate research data committee if you have something like that, and try to put these ideas in front of them. You probably have a research administration committee that will need to know about this. You may have a data governance committee, and although they are probably focused on administrative data issues, this may be something that they're interested in as well. You probably have a records management committee, a sort of joint IT library committee, an IT leadership committee, various security and compliance committees. And I know that's a lot of work and it's a lot of people to get to know depending on how large your university is. But I find at least that, you know, that all of those are absolutely critical. You can't drop any one of them or the whole thing sort of falls apart. A chunk of your life cycle drops out if you lose one of these committees. Next slide. So now I'm just going to talk about your opportunities for improvement. And so the easiest place to start is really just to create some common communications forums. So, and basically I just mean big meetings with lots of people talking to one another. This addresses the problem of institutional self-awareness. People who learn who other people are, they learn what they do, they learn what services are available to researchers, and they can ask each other what would make this easier for you. So in our research data lifecycle group, we have people from the data planning side, which is the low libraries. We have our sort of data acquisition people, which is sort of contract licensing and that sort of thing. We have data transfer people in the form of our research network services. So you've got to be able to, you know, physically transfer the data from place to place. We have our security people such that once we transfer that data, it's going into a secure place. We have our desktop IT people so that they know how to properly secure that computer. We have the librarians in the room who are then responsible once we get to your open access requirements and your open data requirements. So we really have the whole group of people from across the room meeting weekly, and what you see is in a very short amount of time, you get a rapid short-term decrease in delays and misunderstandings as those people get to know one another better. And what that does is it means researchers don't have to try so hard to figure out the system, because now if you contact sponsored programs about acquiring a data set, they can both point you to the libraries to help with your data management plan, as well as point you to the right IT people to help you acquire that data, physically acquire that data when you're done. And so that's two things you now don't have to figure out. So the disadvantage of these common communications forums is that they are informal, they are person-based, they don't result in repeatable processes. So if you're looking at a sort of institutional maturity model, it won't give you institutional maturity, but it will give you an instantaneous improvement in your ability to handle research data. So next slide. And this one is the sort of second hardest thing to put in place, is what we're referring to as a research concierge service. And basically what that is you say, well, it's very difficult to improve the overall functioning of a complicated university, but it's not that hard to hire a few people who understand how that complicated university works and have the researchers contact them. So that's what we're doing here. We are creating value by facilitating connections on behalf of the researcher and on behalf of the various services. So the concierge learns the ecosystems, understands the services offered throughout the ecosystem, and connects those services in the right order at the right time over time. The advantage here is that only the concierges have to learn anything new. The researchers don't have to learn anything new, and the services don't have to learn anything new. So they don't have to get to know one another or sort of improve themselves. And so that is that's frankly a huge advantage. We have that in place at Penn State now in a few of our colleges in two different models. We have models in which the research administrators hire an IT person to work in research administration and learn how research administration works. We also have IT units who are hiring people who is essentially the same job, but in some cases they're hired in research administration, in some cases IT. I don't think it really matters. The disadvantage of this is that somebody has to found, fund, and administer this service. So you need to get your concierges together and making sure that they're all on the same page. You need to have education in place for them and all of that sort of thing. But I would say that if I had one thing to pick to promote, this would be the one I would start with. Put some concierges in place. And the next one, please. This one I'm going to skip. It is very important and works. It's a good slide, but it's very difficult as a faculty member to have much influence over whether or not this can take place. So I will skip to the next slide. This one, again, I think you can help with, again, through influencing those people and committees that we talked about earlier. And the thing to do here is to try to get those various services across your campus to adopt common workflow tools. So what you're going to get here is you're going to formalize the workflow messaging between the services. You're going to formalize the information that's passed between the services. You're going to decrease your delays and miscommunication by doing that. I would say you really can't do this without first having had those common communication forums in place for a while so that they can figure out what workflow tool might work. Disadvantage here is you need high-level executive support across multiple university organizations, all the ones I mentioned earlier, because they all have to be willing to buy into utilizing a common workflow tool, which is not that easy to get done. And then someone has to fund the thing. You need an administrative unit to run the thing, and all of that can be very complicated. And then probably the biggest disadvantage is you really do have to do significant business process analysis to sort of make this happen. So it's really a strong commitment to compromise and change is what you need here. Somebody's going to have to give. If everybody already has a workflow tool, almost everyone will have to give up the one they have because you're only going to use one. So it is, this one is definitely one of the harder ones to put in place. Now I think we will move to the hardest one of all on the next slide, which is essentially organizational restructuring. So what I would personally love to see, but we are, I think, a long way from that, is an organization at your university which is specifically optimized to respond to challenges surrounding research data and cyber infrastructure as well, across the research lifecycle, all the way from pre-proposal to post-publication. And we really don't have that now. I'm honestly, not in any form. I do believe that a university that did this would give you a distinct competitive advantage in proposal submissions, and security and compliance, and cyber infrastructure planning, and public access, and all of these areas. The disadvantage of trying to do this is it could affect all of those 20 diverse administrative units we discussed earlier. They haven't always worked effectively together in the past. And for most of those, issues surrounding research data and cyber infrastructure are only a small part of what they do. So essentially, parsing out the chunk of sponsored programs, for instance, which is related to research data, is a difficult in and of itself. So finding those research data specific people in these 20 units and bringing them together so that they can specifically focus on optimizing research data challenges would be a very tricky thing to get done. So that is that one. And that one I think would take, probably several years, at least at some place the size of Penn State, several years to get that done, and would need to work through all the committees we discussed earlier. Next slide. So already to the summary, I hope I went fast enough. I did not track the time. So in summary, we've got increasing regulatory and contractual requirements surrounding research data. Everything from you must publish this in an open place to you may not ever share this. So it's really the whole range. And I think that these increasing requirements have exposed limitations in the way we organize ourselves as universities. We are not organized to optimize the handling of research data, and particularly, we just don't have the tools or the structures to handle research data over the long timescales that can apply to research projects. I view this, until this sort of magical unified organization comes into place, this will be a strongly cross-disciplinary effort for the foreseeable future. Many approaches will work, and I just outlined 5 that are in my head, but I'm sure other approaches would work as well. But I would basically just encourage faculty to start off, try to get some common communications forums in place, get these units together, have them start talking to one another, and then maybe you build from there to putting a concierge in place, to adopting some workflow tools, and then to maybe restructuring your organization to do this better in the future. I believe that is the last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was fantastic. Is it time for questions?
Nope, we're gonna move on to Carl now.
All right, well, that's what we'll do then. So let me tell you a little bit about Carl Benedict. He's been working since 1986 in parallel tracks of information management, geospatial information technology, and archaeology within the College of University Libraries and Learning Services. He's at the University of New Mexico. He serves as an associate professor, also as the director of the Research Data Services Program, and as a subject liaison for the Departments of Geography and Environmental Studies, Earth and Planetary Sciences, and Computer Science. In his role as the Director of Research Data Services, he works with his team to support effective research data management by researchers at the University of New Mexico through instruction, training, consultation, and infrastructure support. And his current research includes the development of open standards-based interoperable data management workflows and infrastructure in support of diverse research projects, and streamlining the integration of research data products into long-term preservation systems to maximize the ongoing value of those data beyond the projects in which they're collected or generated. You can see how Carl and Greg have such an interesting space, but a different point of view. Carl, please go ahead.
Sure, thanks, and thanks for asking me to present here. Today, I think this actually is a really great combination of these different perspectives in terms of developing and supporting faculty research data management, as what I'm going to talk about is sort of turning the telescope around with the perspective from the university library as being sort of a hub within the university with which many of our faculty and other researchers within the university interact, looking for support for their research. And I'm going to talk today about the development of our research data services as a fairly organic process that originated in the library and is now expanding out to address many of those challenges and needs that Greg highlighted in his presentation in terms of institutional needs and achieving more efficient and effective management at the institutional level. So next slide, please. So we've actually been in the research data services business at the University of New Mexico in our libraries for a fair amount of time. We were relatively early in the process of recognizing the needs for being able to integrate research data support services into the library. And that really began with this RDS 1.0 that I'll go through in a little bit more detail, is really a distributed model in which we are leveraging sort of existing resources within the library. With our the formulation of our research data services program as a specific program in 2014, we evolved towards a more unified model that I'll talk a little bit about. And now, most recently, we have been building on our connections with units across campus to try to develop a more collaborative model that is more efficient in taking advantage of and making effective connections to the existing resources across the entire campus and even off campus to support our researchers. So we really have sort of three phases of development that that we've gone through, and I'll highlight those in the rest of my presentation. So starting, we have this this collaborative. And next slide, please. You know, we start out first with this distributed model in which we were really responding in the library to a recognition of this changing landscape of requirements from funding agencies and more recently requirements from publishers that essentially are the researchers that we're supporting develop more systematic approaches to the management and sharing and preservation of their data. And in response to that, we actually established in 2010 and 2011 the development of research data services by the library in support of the research enterprise across the campus. And under the umbrella of that strategic objective, we started to do a number of things. As we went through a round of hiring of subject librarians to fill some vacancies that had arisen, we explicitly brought data and data management support, familiarity with research data management needs into those positions that had been more traditional library subject librarian positions previously. So we explicitly started embedding data into our subject librarian search and evaluation. We created a new data curation librarian position that we filled, so that we had someone who was specifically hired to assist with data curation librarians, library work. I actually came in part-time into the library back in about 2011, while I was still the director at the Earth Data Analysis Center, an applied research center here, to essentially be able to provide, in some respects, almost like freelance support for a variety of the data initiatives within the library. So I was able to start to bring in some additional data expertise that didn't already exist. And then, of course, we were expanding our capabilities with our library information technology group and working with our digital initiatives and scholarly communication group. Overall, basically leveraging a lot of existing capabilities that were distributed throughout the library in what turned out to be a somewhat diffuse but growing capability to be able to support research data management. We also started to build our core infrastructure that the library provides in terms of our institutional repository based on the DSpace platform, shared storage, essentially locally hosted alternative to Dropbox or Google Drive that an increasing number of our researchers were using. And then also a locally hosted collaborative code development environment based on GitLab, so that our researchers would have that available as another piece of infrastructure. All three of those are infrastructure that the library developed and hosted and were supported by the library and our research data management personnel. And then we also started to establish other core capabilities, for example, developing an institutional profile within the DMP tool as another way to direct and support our researchers as they were working to meet the compliance requirements as a part of their proposal development. But you can only go so far, next slide, with this sort of distributed and decentralized approach. And in 2014, we established our specific research data services program and really brought a unified face to what had been this more distributed support model. And of course, when you establish a program, you get a brochure, which is what we have here, summarizing the various areas of support and consultation that we're able to provide in terms of data management planning, supporting data management in terms of developing strategy and the workflows, assisting researchers in identifying useful analysis tools and technologies, of course, supporting the infrastructure that we had developed previously, being able to bring those within a unified service model, and then also starting to increase our instruction and training in terms of developing workshops and doing library instruction type one-off sessions for research groups, and then also occasionally contributing to credit courses. All of those were more formalized with the establishment of our Research Data Services program in 2014, where we have a more structured capability, a more structured way of communicating our work, and a more explicit strategy of linking the services that we're providing to the research process that our researchers are most familiar with. So this was a way to increase the visibility and the impact of our program through having a more clear point of contact for our researchers. And in many respects, next slide, we're setting the stage for this emerging collaborative model where we're taking advantage of the linkages that we have across campus and even beyond campus to address the needs of sustainability and scalability, where we've been able to bootstrap our services to support researchers across campus, largely on internal capacity within the library. But as any of us that are working in university environments know, we're all working in resource-constrained environments in which we can only go so far, essentially within our existing resources. So part of this this work that we're doing now in terms of connecting and making more productive use of our connections is developing partnerships and aligning the work that we're doing in the library with other initiatives across the campus. Just as Greg was highlighting the needs for being able to not reinvent the wheel, make sure that we're leveraging each organization's, each group's core areas of competency and skill on campus, and make sure that that we're getting the most impact for the limited resources that we're able to invest. In our case, within the library, we have our still very close coordination between our research data services, our digital initiatives and scholarly communication group, our outreach librarians, who remain one of our primary connection points to faculty out in the departments, and of course working very closely with our library IT. But as we extend outside of the library, as our campus information technology program is going through a major reorganization right now, we're at the table as in a number of their advisory groups, making sure that research infrastructure is a part of information technologies planning. We're working closely with our research office, both with our faculty research development officers as a resource that they increasingly are increasingly referring researchers to us for support in their data management planning. We work with a number of large-scale research programs across campus, the Environmental Data Initiative, Earth Data Analysis Center, Data One. These are all large-scale initiatives that we're leveraging our long-standing connections with to continue to expand and build the sustainability of our program. We're also working very closely with our Center for Advanced Research Computing, looking at being able to couple these parallel and increasingly connected issues of access to computational capacity with access to research data management and analysis tools. And we're working closely with our research computing group to see how we can leverage the infrastructure and services that they're providing with an overlay of research data management capabilities. And then, of course, we're working with external collaborators like the Federation of Earth Science Information Partners in development of their clearinghouse of research data training materials, leveraging the capabilities provided by the Open Science framework, working with the Digital Preservation Network to help define the ongoing evolution of their platform. And then working in our case with the Greater Western Library Alliance to see where there may be opportunities for developing consortial capabilities across institutions that can also help us more effectively support the researchers within the university. But this remains a somewhat organic process as we're leveraging existing relationships that we have to be able to expand our impact and capabilities, but then continuing to grow that network and do so in a way that seems reasonably paced with our capabilities as they're developing. So finally, as we go to the final slide, the question of where do we go from here? We do need to continue to think about the evolving needs of our researchers, and we hear again and again, there's a lot. high demand for storage capacity, and that's one area where we're continuing to work with our research computing folks in developing a business and cost model for storage. Access to computation, effective platforms for sharing data, streamlining workflows for getting research data into preservation and sharing systems so that the expectations of sponsors and publishers can be met. And of course, meeting also institutional compliance requirements in terms of data security, data access, data preservation to be able to have the institution be able to do the work it needs. So we're definitely continuing to expand our network with partners with the ultimate goal of continuing to try to actually make it easier rather than harder to work in this increasingly complex environment of collaborative data intensive research. So we've developed this capability largely from the bottom up, focusing first on the capabilities that the library can bring to the table and then expanding outward to bring in other partners and collaborations to be able to scale and sustain the capabilities that we've built. And with that, I think I'm done.
Thank you so much to both of our presenters. We appreciate all of the wonderful content you've been able to share with us. I think what we'll do now is go through some of the questions, and I'll be happy to moderate those. We have had some questions come in during the presentations, and I will start with Greg. I believe this is for you. We had a participant that says, I work at a small college where we don't have large communities or that have many administrators. Can you speak to how to enable this at a small college as opposed to at a research university like Penn State?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can. I mean, I don't really know the context there. So, you know, essentially, if you're at a small college, I would think that the set of services, I mean, really, you just want to get yourself a research data lifecycle diagram, of which AGU has one, and there are many others. But so you have to make sure that someone at your university is satisfying each element of the research data lifecycle, both on the sort of pedagogical side of research, so knowing what kind of data you have, doing a research data management plan, and then following that through to your sort of open access and open data side of things, but as well as your technical side of data. So, you know, do you have the networking capacity to transfer it? Do you have network people? Do you have, you know, someone who can do that transfer for you, put it in a secure place, put the proper compliance controls around it? So you're bound to have someone, at least at your university, who is your IT person. And a lot of people start with your IT person, and then you're bound to have someone who, as in Carl's case, is the sort of library side of things. You may as well have someone who does grants and contracts, a grants officer or somebody like that. I would start with those three people. So an IT person, a library person, and a grants person, and work it through that. I think that at the very base level, those are the three groups which are going to be most heavily involved. So I would look for those people and make sure they're talking to one another about these kinds of questions.
Great, thank you so much. Another question has come in. How well do funder data management requirements align with researcher workflows and library university support?
I can probably start with that, and in many instances we've found that those requirements are currently sort of in addition to or an extension of the current workflows that many of the researchers that we support already have in place. So in a lot of the consultation work that we do, we're introducing our researchers to concepts around documentation and preservation that are somewhat new as a part of the way that they envision doing their research data management and developing their research workflows, because they are, you know, they come from, in many instances, a project-focused planning process that really does emphasize the work during the life cycle of the project, not necessarily over the broader life cycle of the data that are a product of that project. So in many respects, it's an extension that we're hopefully able to build on their existing workflows and not disrupt their existing productive workflows, you know, to the extent possible.
Great. Now,
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
May I build on that? So I agree with everything Carl said there. So what we're attempting to do at Penn State is make this stuff invisible as far as we can. So we're trying to take advantage of the research administrative systems that we already have in place, such that when a publication takes place, we essentially do all the work of getting that out to the public, so that the researcher basically only has to check one box that says, yes, I agree, this should be open, right? So we're trying to make it not be disruptive to their workflow, because right now it is disruptive. If you think, I think what Carl said is exactly right, is mostly project-based thinking up to this point. So if I'm a researcher, I finish my project, I send the paper off to be published, and I sit the data over here. Well, now, you know, maybe 18 months later, I find out that, yay, I'm accepted for publication. My incentive to go back and grab that data that I put aside 18 months ago and do a lot of work with it is extraordinarily small. It's not going to help with tenure and promotion. So what we have to do is make that work disappear, because I don't think a lot of people are going to do that work themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this might expand on that comment, but a follow-up question, we'd like you to speak to some of the most frustrating components of the funder data management requirements, and how would you suggest that they actually be changed or improved?
Well, I can start on that one, and Carl, you can jump in afterwards. So really, the frustrating aspects are at both ends of things. So it's the open side and the secure side. On the secure side, so there's new NIST requirements in place. So if you're getting, you know, sort of controlled data, you now have 117 technical requirements you have to meet instead of whatever your IT department happens to do for security. That can be very frustrating. We had a person take 9 months to get approved for data, and it was only a 6-month contract. That was clearly very frustrating to him. So that is, in some sense, what initiated this whole thing. At the open data side, it's also it's frustrating for people that, at least here, we don't have, or I shouldn't say we don't have, we have too many data management plan templates. They're scattered all over the university. People can't find the one they want, so everybody ends up writing data management plans from scratch. There's an enormous amount of it which is just boilerplate. So at least at a place like this, it's getting the boilerplate in one place, getting the various places who have a data management plan to come together and create sort of a master data management plan where you can just drop chunks in and out. And I realize such things exist on the internet, but you know, we do need to get that done. So I think we're seeing people frustrated both on the open data side as well as on the secure data side.
And I might add, you know, another one of the challenges that we've been working to try to address more recently gets back to this question of sustainability of services, especially when we're talking about the preservation side of things. The current funding models and sort of sponsor models in terms of developing budgets and developing and identifying funding to pay for long-term preservation remains a work in progress, where, you know, I was actually just contributing to a data management plan and a project budget last fall, where, you know, we were building into that 5-year project budget funds to support up to 20 years of preservation of the project data after the end of the project. And it remains not entirely clear how our both our auditors, our internal budget folks, and the funding agencies will react to essentially requests for expenditures for future services, which data preservation is absolutely one of those investments that has to be made that, you know, has an ongoing cost beyond the life of a project. And it remains unclear how we handle that in the context of individual projects or institutional resources that are needed to account for that preservation. The other part of it is developing strategies at the institutional level for being able to capture and plan around the commitments that are being made by the institution through the submission of proposals in terms of essentially institutional assets like preservation or data storage, where we currently don't have a solid connection between the proposals going through our internal process and the submission process and how they actually align with the storage and preservation capabilities we have in place. So there are some planning capabilities that also you know, provide some challenges as we want to make sure we have the necessary infrastructure to support the research that's going on across the institution.
Yeah, and I'd like to piggyback on that. I, again, agree with absolutely all of that. So we're doing two things right now. We're starting a sort of, you might think of it as data mining of our grant submission software so that we can start to pull out cyber infrastructure requirements and make sure that we are utilizing the information we have in the grant side of the house to inform our cyber infrastructure planning. We are in baby stages there. The other thing we're doing is we, you know, as Carl said, that they have, we also have an open access repository as well as an open data repository. The open access repository is hard money, but the open data repository is funded by soft money. So we're attempting to change that so that that is also on hard money. But, you know, it's one thing to preserve 4 or 5 terabytes of data, and it's another thing to preserve 25 petabytes of data. So no one knows where the money's going to come from to sort of permanently store things under these open data requirements.
Right, absolutely. Thank you both for that wealth of information. We do have a simple clarifying question, and we wanted to know, what is it meant by a data maturity model? We don't understand that term.
Sorry, so I shouldn't have used that. So there's an institutional maturity model. I think it's called the capabilities maturity model, possibly. And basically, your institution, you can rate it, you can utilize it for anything. But basically, if your processes are based around people knowing one another, if they're not repeatable, then you're basically a 1 on the maturity scale. And if all of your processes are well-defined, repeatable, and are based on sort of the office or the role as opposed to the person in the role, then you can move the scale up to a 5 on the maturity model. And I think what most places find is, if you look at this, you can find pockets in your university for almost anything in which you're mature. But at least at Penn State, we struggle to go past a 1 on the maturity model on anything institutionally, because there's places where it falls apart. So that's what the maturity model is, very, very briefly. But you should be able to Google that and find more information than you would ever want to know about the maturity model.
And I might add to that I agree completely, and I would go back to one of the points that Greg made, perhaps on his last and most challenging strategy, in terms of the number of separate administrative units that need to be working together across the university to support effective research data management, makes it incredibly challenging to move beyond that point, because so much of it is trying to you know, essentially interlock that number of gears at the institution. Because I would definitely put us here at UNM also in that neighborhood of 1. As you know, it's through sheer force of the individual relationships that we are forging between these organizations that we're able to have the degree of coordination that we have. institutionalization, formalization of that is still in its infancy.
Great, excellent,
Yeah,
thank you.
Reference to the maturity model. Take a look at the CMMI Institute. Their work was done in conjunction with Carnegie Mellon, and that's where you can get all the details on how that works.
Great, thank you so much for that. Are there any other comments that you'd like to provide? Right now, we don't have any other questions coming in, but I'd like to open the floor to the audience and see if there are any other comments or questions that you would like to ask of our speakers. We'll wait a couple seconds here to see if anyone raises their hand or wants to type something in the chat box. Anything coming in? It doesn't look that way. Carl or Greg, would you like to provide any closing comments, or Shelley?
I might just want to add that, related to that early question about smaller institutions that don't necessarily have large scale capacity for robust sort of internal systems. I would definitely also recommend looking at existing consortial opportunities. So if your small institution is a part of a regional organization, for example, I mentioned the Greater Western Library Alliance that UNM is a part of, where we are looking at ways to achieve some economies of scale or do things more efficiently with shared activities across our members, as opposed to individual universities taking on some of these roles. And that's especially useful when you're thinking about potentially investing in preservation infrastructure capacity, being able to have shared resources for supporting researchers where you might not have the capacity to even have a single FTE, but possibly with some partners, you could scrape together a person who could provide that type of support. Also looking for organizations like the Digital Curation Center and the wealth of information that they've brought together, or the ESIP Federation's clearinghouse of data management training materials as another location for sort of self-training or even sort of work team, research team level self-training or other strategies for being able to sort of level up your capacity as a small institution where you don't necessarily have the institutional resources to provide high-level support.